everyone, welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything going on in the world of Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and today's episode is going to sound a little bit different and look a little bit different, and that is because I am traveling. And I know what you're thinking, did she go to the Monaco Grand Prix? No, in fact, she did not. While all of the very cool people were in Monaco on yachts, I am actually in London because I went to Silverstone for MotoGP this weekend. So that means that if this episode sounds a little bit different, looks a little bit different if you're watching it on YouTube, that's because we are inside a hotel room and we are doing our best. Because while I may be gone, it's the Monaco Grand Prix. I never miss the Monaco Grand Prix. So I just wanted to get those disclaimers out of the way. If you're sitting there and you're thinking, she's not normally on a blue couch in front of lots of pictures of London if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're just listening and things sound a little bit different, that is what's going on here. I also want to point out that if the vibe is a little bit different this week, it's because I've been up since just before 6 this morning in order to get to Silverstone in time for a paddock tour and to explore the MotoGP world. I'll be covering all of that obviously on social media the way I always do, so if you're interested in that MotoGP coverage, make sure to follow me on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. All of those are at Marissa Kumari, as they've always been. So if the vibe is a little different, that's what the vibe is. That's what's going on. But I, in fact, did not miss the Monaco Grand Prix, and I want to point out that things were a little chaotic just like being able to watch the race at all, because the MotoGP race at Silverstone ended just after 2 p.m. And as I mentioned, I am in the UK where F1 TV does not work. You have to have Sky Sports. You cannot rewatch the replay as you normally would on F1 TV. And to be honest, I thought, in fact, I was going to miss the Monaco Grand Prix. But I and all of you who enjoy listening to this podcast on time have a lovely man named Dylan to thank, because on the shuttle home, I was trying desperately to get a stream up, and then out of the corner of my ear, I heard the commentary for F1 and I hunted that man down. Okay, I did. I walked around that bus because we were not moving, and I looked for the sound of the person who had an actual stream of the Formula One race. And when I found him, he was sitting alone, and I said, "Are you watching Formula One?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Can I please watch with you?" And he said, "Absolutely." And so Dylan and I did watch Monaco on the bus, then on the train, and we stood up the entire time because the train back from Milton Keynes was completely full. And quite frankly, I have never been more thankful to a stranger. And I also wanted to open up talking about that because there's something really lovely in the way that Formula One fans interact with each other. We were coming back from another race, obviously, so obviously we already had sort of a common interest, but it was a completely different series, and as soon as I saw that he was watching it, I very much just walked up and asked if I could watch with him. And there's just like an instant kind of friendliness, I think, that comes from finding another Formula One fan in the wild, because we talked about Formula One for a minute, and while he was kind of adjusting the stream so that I could see it, he asked who I was a fan of, and I told him Lewis, obviously, but obviously that this season has been kind of tough, and I am, open to supporting people in general. I don't hate anybody. And then when I asked him who he supported, he was like, "Don't ask," which in Formula One terms means it was Max Verstappen. We figured that one out pretty quickly. But as you guys know, I actually don't have anything against Max, and it was really lovely because the two of us were sitting there and he was like, "I have nothing against Lewis. I like Lewis." And it was really nice because clearly both of us have had experiences where people have interacted and kind of not necessarily been very positive about our favorite driver, let's put it that way. But the two of us were able to talk about that, commiserate, bond, and you know what? He saved my Monaco Grand Prix. So this episode is brought to you by Dylan, a man whose last name I'll probably never know, but who I am forever thankful for. So now that we've talked about the magic of Formula One, let's talk about the magic of Monaco. Because obviously most of what we have to talk about, as we always have with Monaco, happened before the race even started. Let's get into what was going on heading into this race, everything that happened before, and then of course the race itself. And of course we will still go through everyone's hot takes and predictions, but I do want to point out before we get started that last week's hot takes and predictions went pretty well. Yeah, so you heard it here first actually. You heard it a week ago. Lando Norris won the Monaco Grand Prix, and you know what? He was always destined to do it. But let's talk about how he got here. I'm gonna be honest, watching the practice sessions this week, I don't know if anybody else felt like we were just kind of getting slowly tortured if you're into Ferrari at all, because all of a sudden things actually looked good. We were seeing Charles Leclerc go to the top of the timesheets consistently. If you were just looking at the timesheets, things really kind of looked good for both of the Ferrari drivers across all 3 free practices. But there were obviously a couple of moments where that was not the case. One, we have a moment where Lewis Hamilton completely defies gravity as though he is the alpha of Formula One, and quite literally went over a curb and all 4 wheels were in the air. I watched that clip over and over again because it honestly was like, I was like, how do we make a Fast and the Furious movie out of this? I was kind of shocked that the car didn't end up having damage, and also that he was able to take that much air. Everything about it seemed absolutely bonkers to me, honestly. And as much as I wish that everything had just gone smoothly for him and for Charles, there is something really fun about that clip. I just think it was one of those moments where you just don't expect that to be the case that comes out of that. Like, all four wheels of a Formula One car completely airborne, I don't know what we're talking about here. Like, that is insane. But it also was sort of indicative of the way that practices were going. We had a couple of people clip the wall, we had a collision between Lance Stroll and Charles Leclerc, and I think a lot of that came from the fact that these drivers were absolutely sending it from the very first free practice, which I think is something that's really important about Monaco. If you listen to these drivers talk about Monaco, the second that you back out is the second that this course can get really dangerous. It is really high speed, it is a very technical track, and from a driver's standpoint, it does take a lot of skill. We have this constant conversation about Monaco being boring, about the fact that it doesn't allow passing, that these cars are too big for this track, and that there's this argument that it should be taken off the race calendar. But quite frankly, I think that the Monaco Grand Prix is a weekend that actually every session feels exciting instead of maybe just the race. Free practice sessions feel like they're giving you some indication of where everything's going, and also you're seeing these drivers really try to get that practice in, because this is the Monaco Grand Prix and everything is kind of decided in qualifying. So those free practice sessions actually are really important. We can't see as much, hopefully, sandbagging as we usually would. They can't test a ton of different things. These drivers really need to lock in and get that lap because this is the only chance that they have to test through. And if they don't completely lock in and get a perfect lap for qualifying, they may as well just go home before the race starts. And so I can't really say if I'm in the minority of this, but free practice sessions are worth watching during Monaco because of this type of stuff. And I think qualifying at Monaco is one of the most exciting days on the calendar. We'll get into more of that during kind of like the hot takes and predictions section, because I am sure a lot of you have hot takes and predictions regarding whether or not Monaco should actually be on the calendar, but I really enjoy free practice during the Monaco weekend. As much as it's stressful to see these drivers get so close to the wall, to see double punctures happening, to see these drivers kind of lose control of the car, it's also a moment where you're actually seeing these drivers get pushed to the extreme limits of their actual ability. They're pushing these cars to their extreme limits as well. And all of that excitement that you're kind of used to in a race weekend is coming just in different sessions. Because how often are you really excited to watch free practice? At Monaco, there's usually actually a pretty decent amount of action during all three. And so again, I just think it's a balance of where everything is. Yeah, everything is pretty much decided by qualifying, but there's a lot of excitement that happens until you get there. A couple of other moments from free practice, obviously Oscar clipped the wall and just sort of left his front wing. We also saw Isaac clip the wall as well, which I think was a good note to have because of where he ends up in qualifying. I will say, frankly, I was kind of surprised we didn't have bigger accidents, especially with how many rookies we have on the grid, though obviously they've run the course before in F2, and if you didn't see the pileup that happened in F2, it's certainly something to look at when it comes to Monaco itself. But I think all in all, we had a pretty exciting set of practices and a shocking kind of lack of serious incident. But I do think the biggest kind of talking point coming out of free practice sessions was Ferrari. Those cars felt so fast. Things really felt like they were hooked up, but the radio chatter didn't sound that way. Charles Leclerc just genuinely seems like he'll never know peace, and I think this weekend was one that really showed that, because despite the timesheets really showing that things were going well for him, his irritation and feeling about the way the car was working was at such a high level. He had a lot of complaints about the way that it was handling, and during the free practice sessions, he was sending pretty negative feedback back to his engineer. And despite him and Lewis looking like things were going pretty well, he just seemed very unhappy. And I guess that kind of ended up being an indication of what was to come. So that takes us through free practice. And the one thing I do want to point out is that this year we were hoping to see Charles Leclerc win Monaco back-to-back, or at least for the story's point, we probably were. Last year, Charles Leclerc won Monaco, and it was a bigger deal than it just being his home race. It was this big thing about feeling like he was cursed at this race specifically. And something else we knew going into this race is that we were going to have a requirement of 2 pit stops for every driver. Now, if you have been following Ferrari at all, you know that that's something that people were concerned about. And the other thing about Monaco is, especially if this is your first year watching Formula One, I think this weekend, this track, it's one of the most storied versions of Formula One. It's one of those races where we're constantly thinking about the history of the sport, the people who've come before, and also how many legends have raced and won at this track. Monaco is the race that every driver wants to win, even if it's not necessarily the race that every fan wants to watch. And especially for Charles Leclerc, winning that home race was a really big deal last year. And so going into the race this year, especially watching these free practice sessions, it kind of felt like it was possible. Like this thing that has been going on at Ferrari might have shifted. But then we head into qualifying. And there are a couple of big moments in qualifying that we should talk about. But the first one I want to talk about is actually with Lewis Hamilton and his race engineer. We have this really frustrating moment where we see Lewis Hamilton be told that Max Verstappen is behind him. And at first he's told he's on a flying lap, which means that he would move out of the way. But then he's told by his race engineer that Max is actually slowing down, which he was not, in fact, slowing down. And the thing about Monaco is that it is hard to see behind you. And so your engineers really have to be locked in and give you the right information. Not only because of just like rules and regulations, but also because of safety. It is a really dangerous dangerous track to suddenly be in the way at. It's very high speed, and there are a lot of places where you're coming around a turn at such high speed that if you're suddenly coming into contact with a really slow or completely stopped car, you might be seconds away from disaster. We saw that last year actually with Isaac Hadjar in F2, where I think honestly it was a highlight reel moment that helped him actually make it into Formula One, where he did narrowly avoid going straight into the back of someone inside the tunnel. It was incredibly strong reflexes, and it was a really important thing because otherwise it would have been a pretty nasty crash. That's kind of the type of thing I'm talking about when I say that I think actually Monaco is a pretty exciting track. It's just that it's a very different and technical track, and it's a different requirement from these drivers. And as we saw with Lewis, it's also a track that requires the engineers to be very focused. And so the fact that Lewis was just completely failed by his engineer in this space was really frustrating, because I think we've seen a lot of positive moves from Ferrari overall. Since Fred has come in, we've seen a lot of personnel changes. We've seen a lot of different kind of moves there. We've seen new people come in, and we've obviously seen Lewis Hamilton come in as a driver. We have seen a lot of positive change, but it seems like race strategy and engineering continues to be the biggest issue for Ferrari. And there's a difference between bad strategy and just fully giving your driver completely incorrect information that could have caused serious harm. It's a dangerous situation to put both Max and Lewis in, and luckily it was between two drivers who are very experienced and do know how to kind of deal with that situation, but it was completely unnecessary and obviously did result in a 3-grid penalty for Lewis in a race where you qualify is usually where you finish. And so I think that moment, and also the moments of listening to Charles Leclerc kind of argue with his engineers about the car itself, has really highlighted the weak point for Ferrari lately. And it seems to be that their drivers have more of an idea of what they should be doing than the engineers do sometimes. And again, obviously these are only things that we're hearing over the radio, but I think both of these drivers have gotten increasingly frustrated with their team, specifically with their engineers on the radio, and they've both reacted to it in different ways. We saw complete frustration from Charles Leclerc last week, and we've seen Lewis kind of go back and forth from frustration, from yelling, from disagreeing, to trying to defend his engineer in the press, to also trying to kind of reason with him. And it just seems like neither one of them are having the results that they need. Neither one of them have been able to find the support that they need in order to win. And so that was really frustrating to watch, honestly. And when we talk about the penalty itself, another thing that was hard was the fact that we all knew that it had nothing to do with Lewis. Lewis Hamilton did not intentionally impede Max, and in fact it was because he was given bad information by his team. I think this is one of those hard things where it does sort of feel like by the rulebook, obviously he received the penalty he should have, but when you have the other driver saying that it obviously wasn't his fault, when you have the driver acknowledging that it also wasn't his fault and acknowledging that it was a problem, it was distracting, and he was sorry for it, not only going to Max right after the session, but also acknowledging this in the actual kind of press run after, when it's so clearly not the driver's fault, it feels like it should be a team penalty, not a sporting penalty. Whether that's a fine or something else, it feels like a race drop is really harsh, but at the same time, Formula One is, as much as we don't want to think about it this way, a team sport. Not just with the two drivers on track making up a team, but also everyone in the garage, on the pit wall, and involved in the team from top to bottom. So while it's frustrating and while it is difficult, it's hard to say that like, oh, it shouldn't be done this way. Because when you're talking about race results, to some degree, it feels like the team itself actually is penalized when the driver is penalized. It's a hard one, it's frustrating, and I think ultimately, obviously, it was kind of followed to the letter of the rule book, but it does seem to some degree unfair that the driver is penalized for the engineer just literally not paying attention. And regardless of whether or not the actual car gets fixed and whether or not we actually see real improvement from Ferrari, moments like these, if they don't fix the engineering, if they don't fix this situation overall, it doesn't really matter if your car is working really well, if your engineer is giving you bad information. I think qualifying really kind of showed that we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to Ferrari, both from communication and from strategy. That being said, we did feel like for a minute we were going to see Charles Leclerc on pole 2 times in a row and take home this Monaco win. And then right at the end, Lando Norris sort of scoots through, but not only scoots through, sets a record for the fastest pole lap ever at Monaco with a sub 70-second lap. This qualifying moment, this pole position from Lando, this was exactly what I was talking about last week and what I feel like I've been talking about for a bit now. Lando really does, in my opinion, have the potential to be a great driver. And I think we talk a lot about this idea of like good driver versus great driver and where that sort of difference is. And I think that's just something that we can't necessarily put our finger on. It's an X factor. It's this situation where you look and you say, oh, I think that driver right there, he has something special. There are these flickers of that from Lando. And I do think underneath it all, under the self-deprecation, under the frustration of it, Lando does have at least a spark of that X factor. And so moments like this where you actually see him completely hook everything up and really lock in, those are the moments where it really feels like Lando not only knows what he's doing, but really puts it all together and wants to win. The question is always with Lando, as we talked about last week, how many good days can Lando have and how many of them can he string together in order? Because I do think Lando needed this. I think he needed to come out, I think he needed to dominate in this kind of qualifying, and I think he needed something very definitive to show that he's still in the game. Not necessarily just for the fans, but also for himself. We've seen an almost instant shift away from Lando being the expected championship winner and sort of the one to beat coming into this season, to Oscar Piastri suddenly having that title. And for a large conversation to be surrounded by, can Lando really kind of contend with his teammate? And so I think Lando needed a big splash, and Monaco qualifying gave him that. And obviously, as we'll get into it, the race gave it to him too. The question really is, can he lock in and continue that? I honestly will say that last week I felt like as long as he actually locked in and really showed up for Monaco, we still had a championship battle on our hands, which clearly we do. So that sort of wraps up the Ferrari and the McLaren aspect of it. Just pointing out though that we didn't see Oscar qualify right behind Lando. It was not a McLaren 1-2. We had Lando Norris on pole, and then directly behind him in P2 we had Charles Leclerc, our hometown hero, and then we had Oscar Piastri, and originally we had Lewis Hamilton qualifying in 4th. This was really interesting to me in particular, not because the McLarens were out front, but because the Ferraris were such strong contenders when it came to this race. I think it wasn't really expected at all, and we just have not been seeing them lock in, but they also perform well at Monaco, and I think that this may potentially be an outlier. We'll have to wait and see in Barcelona. The question is, was this car suddenly much better because they've changed a lot of things and things are working, or was this car much better just because it was suited for Monaco specifically, and will we see that kind of decline come right back? So that kind of covers the very, very top of our qualifying positions. Let's get into the rest of the grid really quickly before we move into the race itself. We had a few other notable moments from qualifying, but one of the ones I want to point out is actually Isaac Hadjar, who actually significantly benefited from this penalty on Lewis Hamilton. Isaac Hadjar became the first rookie to qualify in the top 5 for Monaco after his racing hero Lewis Hamilton did in 2007. And there's something kind of full circle about that, obviously. There are these moments sometimes where we have just like a shift where we can feel the next generation coming up. And with Lewis Hamilton in particular, we have like a very rare moment where we get to see that original generation that inspired the new generation be a part of them making the next piece of history. And so as frustrated as I was about the penalty itself, it is another one of those moments that just kind of almost feels like a little romantic in the sense of like storytelling. Isaac Hadjar grows up idolizing Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton qualifies in the top 5 in his rookie year in Monaco, and that was in 2007. Then in 2025, nearly 20 years later, Lewis Hamilton gets a grid penalty, which allows Isaac Hadjar to actually have that experience. And another fun thing, Lewis Hamilton actually won Monaco the following year in 2008. And I think by the nature of this sport being officially 75 years old, sometimes you get these really cool moments like that, and they're always fun to point out. Also, I just think Isaac has had such a storybook of a season so far. From crashing out in Australia before the race even started, where he was very virally comforted by Lewis Hamilton's father, to then being a very strong performer in VCARB and carrying those points, to qualifying in the top 5 in his rookie year at Monaco. Again, sometimes you can't write it. Like, the symmetry of sports just really works out in a very poetic way sometimes. And Isaac continues to be a driver who I think is not only very impressive, but also really shows where the future of Red Bull could be if we're looking towards that future. One of the things that has been a talking point this season, especially for me, is this idea of what happens to Red Bull after Max does eventually leave. Not necessarily to go to another team, but eventually everybody retires. Who is the next person that steps up in that team? I think Isaac is actually one of the few people who has a chance to prove that it could be him, and it'll be interesting to see him develop as a driver overall. Other big stories from qualifying, we have the Williams boys rounding out in 10th and 11th, which was important for race strategy, which we'll get into. Liam Lawson actually qualifying P9, which was a pretty big deal given the performance that he's had and like the rough season that he's had. Max Verstappen coming 5th, and then you have 3 kind of surprising top 10 qualifiers: Fernando Alonso, Liam Lawson, and Esteban Ocon. And to be honest, it was kind of nice to see them start to have their luck shift. I think this season has been kind of especially brutal on those that we're talking about, though Fernando didn't actually really get a break, as we'll get into for the race. But with Monaco, we all know that it's practically impossible to move past someone on track after qualifying. There's not a lot of passing in the race, and we thought there might be something with this 2-stop strategy, but frankly, I didn't think it was going to make a big change, which it ultimately did not. I think one of the big shocks in qualifying was actually Mercedes. We have Kimi crash, and then we have George have an issue with the car, and from there, their weekend was essentially over, though George did decide to cause a little bit of drama in the race itself. So from a qualifying standpoint, I would say we had a couple of kind of surprises, but also the top was sort of what we were expecting. Ferraris performed well in practice, and ultimately, even though it wasn't for the win, we did see Charles Leclerc qualify 2nd, and we also saw Lewis come in 4th. And again, I kind of worry that this was sort of false hope, that this was a sudden shift in the performance of the Ferrari, but we still have all of the other issues that we have, and that we may not see this car perform as well at other tracks as it did at Monaco. However, that was kind of one of the bigger surprises in this situation. Lando, of course, taking pole with a track record, and then an almost guarantee that Fernando Alonso is going to score points. Then, of course, we have some really disappointing qualifying positions with Alpine, and Ollie Behrman, surprisingly, is nowhere near his teammate. teammate. So that kind of wraps up qualifying. Let's get into the race itself. So I do want to point out that we always say that this race is won in qualifying, but Lando actually had to recover at the start. He had a lockup and he managed to still keep Charles Leclerc at bay, and then everyone sort of filed into line. And I wanted to point this out because not only does Lando end up winning the Monaco Grand Prix in such a spectacular fashion, setting a record in qualifying for pole position, holding off the man who won this race last year, and holding off his own teammate. One of the other things that we talk about with Lando is a struggle to start. And so getting off the line, having a lockup, and still maintaining that lead was a pretty impressive step forward for him. It was a good race for him from gate to gate, and because it's Monaco, there's not much else to say about that. But it was kind of satisfying to watch, because to me, it just means that we still have a title fight on our hands. But of course, one of the things that we're always looking out for in Monaco are safety cars and crashes. We had an early VSC, as well as 2 full retirements from the race. Those were Pierre, who also made contact with Yuki Tsunoda before getting out of the race, and Fernando Alonso, who devastatingly had his closest chance for points and was doing pretty well on this circuit. When it comes to Alonso in particular, I really think a lot about just his mentality and where his mind must be at. This season has really just been so tough, and I can't imagine what it feels like to be someone who had such a legacy that continues to just sort of like feel week after week like those things are going away. And additionally, not only that, but also to like kind of get close to where you want to be, and then just to have it ripped away as soon as you feel like there might be a little bit of success. This race for me for Fernando was really tough because it wasn't a situation like we've had before where we suddenly see him spin with no one around him, or he makes the wrong decision, or he just can't seem to make everything work on track. This one really didn't have anything to do with him, and it's even harder to watch that happen when you're watching a driver that you want to see get their mojo back that just can't. And then suddenly they're having a good lap, they're having good qualifying, they're in the points for Monaco, and then it just falls apart for him, which I really feel for him, honestly. I just feel like it's hard to have this like version of yourself where you were a 2-time world champion and now you just cannot seem to find any luck, which is exactly what he said about himself last week. But I think this is also something that does seem to happen in Formula One pretty often, and I think it's also a sports thing in general. Championship athletes rarely are willing to give up the idea that they might still have one championship left in them. One champion who did retire at the height of his career was Nico Rosberg, which we'll never know if he could have won another championship, what it would have looked like for him and Lewis to continue battling it out, or if this really was the last time he was going to win. But as soon as he won that championship, he announced his retirement and he peaced out. And the last thing that you can say about Nico Rosberg is that he won a world championship. That's not the last thing you can say about Fernando. And frankly, it's not the last thing that you can say about a lot of really incredible drivers. Sebastian Vettel, Lewis Hamilton right now. Hopefully we see Lewis turn it around. Hopefully we see Fernando turn it around. But I don't know that even with the right car, Fernando is winning another championship. And so it's always difficult to watch that decline, but also especially when you start to see a glimpse of who they used to be, when you start to see a glimpse of that glory again. And then it's just taken away by like a cruel twist of fate. And then of course, as expected, we don't see a lot of grid changes except for those retirements. Lewis Hamilton does make up a couple of those positions that he actually had that grid penalty for, which was cool. But there are a couple of main stories of Monaco. The first is this new pit stop rule. In an effort to make the Monaco race more exciting, it was a mandatory 2 pit stop race, which means that every single driver had to pit and they had to use multiple compounds in this race. The goal in that is hopefully you see a different strategy that comes out of it. You see drivers have to take more risks, and you see teams have to potentially shake things up. And while it wouldn't necessarily have resulted in more on-track passing, it should have potentially resulted in more undercutting and overtaking while drivers were going into the pit lane. Unfortunately, because there weren't any rules other than you have to have 2 pit stops, what we ended up seeing was something that was a little contentious, but I don't think it really should have been. And I think it's more contentious because of the way the Williams drivers responded to having done it themselves. Basically, we have 3 teams use the same strategy. VCARB was the team to do it first, but as we see these drivers kind of spread out, we see one driver go into the pits, get their tires changed, and come back out, and then they're asked to drive very, very slow in order to keep the rest of the drivers behind them and slow up the back of the field so that the other driver can go in, get their tires changed, and then get back out. It keeps both of them from losing their position and ultimately keeps all of them in the points. We saw VCARB do it, we saw Williams do it, and we saw Mercedes do that. And from a strategy point of view, it's obviously a strategy that worked and that all of these teams felt was the best option. From a racing point of view, it's definitely not the point of what the 2 pit stops were supposed to do. It's definitely not what they were hoping would happen with it, and it didn't bring a ton of excitement to the track. One thing it did result in was kind of the enemy move of the week. We've never done that before, I'm just throwing it out there. George Russell's attitude this weekend over the radio, ooh. George ends up going off the track because he doesn't like how slow the Williams are driving and getting in front of Alex, leaving the track and getting an advantage, which ultimately obviously means he needed to hand that position back or face a penalty. And when being told that he was going to face a penalty, he refused to hand that position back and just said he would take the penalty. He ends up with 2 penalties in this race, and frankly, I really didn't like the energy. I feel like there's a level of strategy, which is what Williams was doing, and there's a level of not exactly unsportsmanlike conduct, because that's not what this term means. Unsportsmanlike conduct, I think, gets thrown around a lot, but it really is like a term that is used to fine athletes for what they're doing, which is like a little bit different than this. This was just like bad attitude, bad behavior, and it was unsportsmanlike, just not unsportsmanlike conduct. But frankly, I really found it annoying. I know that's kind of like a weird word to use in this context, but it really was. That's what it was. It was annoying. George had a haughty attitude over it, kind of like a kid that just was like kicking his feet. I want to go faster and they won't move out of my way so that I can win Monaco. It's like, yeah, of course. This is called strategy. This is how this works. And I thought not handing the position back was pretty childish. So this one was a low point for me with George. I think I've been going back and forth with George. We've specifically talked about the fact that like no matter how successful he is, no matter how kind of focused he is, a lot of the Formula One fan base in general kind of talks about it as it's like it's lucky. And some of that might come down to the fact that maybe he just doesn't have that X factor that we talked about earlier, this feeling that makes you believe he's going to be successful. But I think if that is the case, a lot of that feeling, that public sentiment, comes from moments like this, where you do make a move that wasn't necessary, that was unsportsmanlike, and was against the rules. And when being told by your team to just hand the position back and go back to being exactly how you're supposed to be on track, you kind of pitch a fit over the radio, and you refuse to give the position back and take the penalty instead. We've talked a lot about kind of driver weaknesses on this show. One of the things that we've talked about with Lando a ton last year was kind of breaking down what was holding him back from winning that championship. With George, I think sometimes it's moments like this, where there seems to be a level of entitlement in a space like sports where you're supposed to be judged by your merit. You should only be able to win if you are good enough to win. And so when you throw kind of like a tantrum over something that you did wrong, that you knew was wrong when you did it, I think sometimes those are the moments where people don't feel like he has that little X factor. And it's frustrating to watch overall. Outside of George, obviously we see all three of those teams use that strategy, which allows their drivers to stay in the positions that they want to stay in. Though we also saw both Mercedes drivers wait an incredibly long time to go for their actual pit stops. Across the board, I know this strategy kind of backing one driver up was a contentious one, but I also think two teams looked at the race, looked at the strategy, and said this is the best way for us to move forward. And for both VCARB and Williams, it was beneficial in terms of points. So it's hard to say that it wasn't the right move. When we see Liam Lawson score points for the very first time, we see both VCARB drivers have their highest career finish, and of course Williams gets some more points on the board. The one thing that I do think made this partially very contentious was the way that the Williams drivers reacted to this situation. For both Alex and Carlos, they mentioned that it's not the way that they want to go racing, that it wasn't necessarily their favorite thing to do, and that they knew each other were upset about the situation. And while I understand that you want to come and be the fiercest competitor that you are, and maybe play within the expectations of the rules, not just the black and white of how you can kind of skirt those rules, I also think that it was a strategy that multiple teams ran. It was the right strategy, and it was a strategy that's been run at Monaco before, even when there weren't two pit stops, even when there was just a mandatory one stopper. So to some degree, I respect it, because you're saying I want to compete in the best way that I can, not necessarily play games. But on the other side of it, it feels like you're kind of making a mountain out of a molehill when you know that everybody competed this way. So it's a tough one. And then one of the other big moments in this race was Max. We see Max get all the way to the front, but without that second pit stop that he needed to have. And every lap, I just continued to get more and more stressed. When are they going to pit him? When are they going to bring him in? And then ultimately, I think this is what happened. But again, I have to remind you, I was watching this on the train with someone else's Sky Sports subscription over their shoulder. So it's possible that I'm not going to get this exactly right. But had Max not actually taken that second pit stop, he would have received, I believe, a 30-second penalty. And that 30-second penalty looked like it was going to put him net the same position if he did take that pit stop. So technically, weighing the odds, if he takes the pit stop, he takes that 30-second penalty and he ends up in the same position that he ends up even with taking the pit stop in the last lap. Ultimately, I think what was going on here is he was just hoping for an incident that would have caused a safety car, a red flag, any type of situation where they would have bunched that up and he would have gotten that free pit stop. Ultimately, it never came, and we see him take it at the very last minute after holding out, which of course then means that Lando Norris wins the Monaco Grand Prix. And while it was not a big fight on track, though we did see Charles Leclerc get quite close to him at certain points, and we also saw Max get quite close to Oscar at certain points, I do think looking at a Monaco win, it's always hard fought before the race starts, and also staying completely locked in. I think last year we heard Charles Leclerc talk about this and talk about how from the lead, you have to make sure you're not zoning out. You have to finish this race because it's a very technical race and it's very hard. It's very high speed and there are a lot of possibilities of crashing. And so I think you also have the same thing with Lando that I think we should point out. This is a hard track. Anybody who wins it really has a strong level of skill and speed. Just because they tend to win it in qualifying doesn't mean that it's not a very intense track. And that kind of covers the actual race itself. At Monaco, to me, even with the race itself not being super exciting, there not being a lot to talk about, it is a really great track to me. I really think it's an exciting weekend. And it's important to point out that just because the race race itself doesn't involve passing doesn't mean that it's not a hard-fought win. And I think there were some cool takeaways from this race. That does wrap up the race recap, so let's get into your questions, hot takes, and predictions as always. Okay, so we have a couple of questions about what my opinion was on the two-stop rule, so I will just cover it all at once. I don't think the two-stop rule made the racing itself more exciting. I don't think it resulted in any overtaking, and frankly, it also resulted in slower racing, like physically slowing the grid down. I do think it involved different strategies, and the race was marginally more exciting than last year's race. Last year's race, I think, really heavily relied on excitement from like your actual emotional connection to Charles Leclerc and his story. The race itself, as Max said, was so boring that you should have brought a pillow. This year, I do think the race itself was a little bit more exciting, but it still wasn't on-track overtakes, and quite frankly, at Monaco, I don't think it ever will be. So did it really make a difference? I don't know that it did, but I also think it like was at least an attempt, and I think that that's a good thing. I think trying to adjust the way that we move forward with these races and trying to address those kind of concerns are a good thing. And change is sometimes a good thing. I think trying to find different changes and to adjust to a modern Formula One era is better than trying to just stick to something because it's tradition for tradition's sake. So overall, do I think it fixed everything? No. Do I think it's good that we're trying to find a way to make things more interesting? Yeah. Let's go to the next question. How can we get Lewis a new engineer? Comms are painful. Yo, bro, same. I know that's not a very strong and thoughtful answer, and I do also think that a lot of this is growing pains. From an emotional standpoint, yes, I want them swapped. From an overall standpoint, I'd say that we've seen Lewis trying to work through this. I think we've seen him defending his engineer in the press in the beginning, but from an outward kind of deterioration point of view, it does feel like we're getting to a little bit of a breaking point, not just for Lewis's engineer, but also Charles Leclerc's relationship with his engineer. And it'll be interesting to see if we see any changes in those lineups, specifically in the engineering and strategy departments at Ferrari, because I do really think that that is where the trouble is coming from. And it's also frustrating when you're seeing a new driver try to adjust, especially a driver who has as much excitement as Lewis Hamilton, who's had as much experience as him. It feels like we should not be having this long of a situation where the engineer relationship is just so completely off. And sometimes it does feel like it's the engineer not really locking in or caring to, especially after the situation in qualifying this week. Do you think Monaco should still be included in the tracks when there are more exciting ones? Yeah, I actually do. I think that this is probably a troublesome question for a lot of people, but I think that, like, as I've said a lot throughout this episode, the weekend itself is exciting. And also from a history's kind of point of view, I really can't imagine not racing in Monaco. I think Monaco itself is this space that is so iconic to Formula One, and it's also so recognizable in kind of pop culture. Formula One is referenced in Iron Man 2 because of Monaco, but before anyone gets in my comments, I do want to point out that yes, while I was in film school, I did do a thesis on the MCU. And also, yes, I am aware that it was the historic Monaco Grand Prix, not the actual Monaco F1 Grand Prix that Tony Stark entered himself into. The point is that I think Formula One and Monaco go so hand in hand, and there are so many pieces of lore that are attached to Monaco. And things like the Great Diamond Heist of the Ocean's 12 promotional campaign, which I've covered a number of times. You can find on YouTube or on my social media for all of the details on that. But like, Monaco is so flashy, it's so glitzy, it's so glammy, but it's also part of the core DNA of Formula One. And the idea of not only getting rid of that from a perspective of the race calendar, from fans, from drivers, but also from the future generations that come into this race, it's really difficult to kind of present them with this idea that you may never win the Monaco Grand Prix because we just don't race it anymore. That is like something people grow up wanting to do. And it's also part of the racing triple crown, which is the 24 Hours of Le Mans, the Indy 500, and the Monaco Grand Prix. Removing the Monaco Grand Prix from the race calendar means that nobody ever gets to do that again. For me, it's a keep, despite the fact that it is not necessarily the best race anymore, but also because it does show an important skill set from these drivers. Winning a race in qualifying still counts as winning a race, and they still have to make their way around the circuit without crashing for the entire time. For me, it's a keep. Obviously, I apparently feel very passionate about this issue. What was Mercedes even doing? What was that strategy? Really great question. I think we've just essentially seen them say that they knew that they had lost the race in qualifying at that point, and points weren't really even ever on the table. I don't know why they raced the way that they did, and I really struggled to understand why they were waiting so long to take any sort of pit stop. And then I've already kind of disclosed my feelings about the way George handled everything. Honestly, I think this was a one bad weekend for Mercedes. We'll see them kind of come back, but boy, was it a rough one. What rule would you add to make Monaco more competitive? This one is particularly funny because we saw so many drivers talking about the rules that they would add if they had the opportunity. And George specifically, actually, I remember seeing he wanted to add sprinklers to the Formula One cars, and everybody got 1 point throughout the race where they could suddenly turn the sprinklers on and everyone had to deal with it. I do think this was funny. I do think it was funny listening to the drivers come up with their rules. For me, I love the idea of it becoming a little bit of a Mario Kart race. Two aspects of it. I think we should have power-ups that you can get, and then you should also have one of those defensive mess with your opponent abilities, being able to throw a banana peel, a shell, anything like that. That would really work for me, and I love Mario Kart. And imagine Mario Kart on the streets of the Monaco Grand Prix. We would love to see it. What was so wrong with what Williams did, and what really was it? I think we did really cover this in the actual recap itself, so hopefully you got a pretty strong answer, but essentially nothing was wrong with what Williams did. I think the thing really was that Alex and Carlos sounded like they just didn't feel like they played the true sport, if that makes sense. Like, this wasn't true racing. Slowing everyone down in order to kind of maintain position is not necessarily true quote-unquote racing. I think that is why they sounded so dramatic about it, but again, they didn't do anything wrong. They did exactly what two other teams did. Was it necessarily within the spirit of what the hope was for a two-stop requirement? Definitely not, but technically completely legal, and just sort of probably a feeling of, I wish we had done something that actually dealt with racing, as opposed to kind of everyone agreeing that we're just going to slow the cars down and let that happen. Which to some degree, I actually respect. I kind of respect the feeling of like, I wish we were able to race properly, though I also respect doing what you need to do in order to keep those points. And now, of course, hot takes and predictions. First, we have the announcers majorly downplayed his win. No real excitement in the announcement. To be totally fair, I think it's hard to come back from the announcement of last year's win. Charles Leclerc had such an emotional win. It had so much of his family history in it. I think anybody winning other than Charles Leclerc, and frankly, even Charles Leclerc winning again, would not necessarily have had that same emotional high, so it's hard to come back from it. But, you know, everybody could always be a little bit more excited, I think. Monaco should move to rotation. If you're not aware of what rotation is, it means that instead of having one race on the calendar every year, we actually rotate multiple tracks throughout those years. This person is suggesting that Monaco should do that, meaning that we would have other tracks that would rotate in and we wouldn't do Monaco every year. I do think this is at least a more interesting take than just get rid of Monaco, but I think I would still be bummed. Williams podium, don't ask me why, for the prediction next week. You know what? Why not? I think it would be fun for Barcelona, for Carlos to end up on the podium, and I've been rooting for an Alex podium as well, so it would be fun to really see them suddenly really shock everyone. I don't know that we'll see a win, because I do still think you're going to see those McLaren boys fighting for it, but it would be cool to see Carlos have a podium in his home race at a team that no one really expected him to be able to do that in. 3 out of 4 of Oscar's last pit stops were over 3.3 seconds, 1 unlucky, 2 coincidence, 3 is a pattern. I would have to fact check this one, because I actually, from the pit stops I remember, they were pretty quick, and I don't think his pit stop times really cost him anything in this race this week. He had to qualify faster than Lando if he wanted to win, and he also needed to qualify faster than Charles Leclerc. He didn't. I think with McLaren, unfortunately, if there's one thing that they're not doing, it's prioritizing either of their drivers or objectively sabotaging either of them. I think the performance you're seeing from both of them is exactly what they're able to give, because the team has made it very clear they have no intention of picking a favorite until they're absolutely forced to do so. And even last year, when it felt like they were potentially being forced to do so, they still didn't. And then lastly, Williams owes Sainz a good race for next week. Again, I think it could be fun. If we're getting into predictions and hot takes, do we feel like we want to manifest that Carlos win in Williams? I will say, while I don't think that that's necessarily what's going to happen, I do think Williams is inching closer and closer to a podium, and I think there's going to be a race where things work out for them, where everything just sort of lines up. But I will say that I think that lineup ends up being for Alex, not for Carlos. But who knows? That's why we call it a hot take. In terms of next week, we are headed to Barcelona. I will actually be at the race, so if you're there, feel free to say hi if you see me. And it's also Carlos Sainz's home race, which will be very exciting and fun, and hopefully we continue to see a strong performance from that team. Things to look out for next week, I think, include Max Verstappen. This was a strong race for him, despite the fact that he ultimately didn't get lucky with a safety car in the way that he hoped he would. Does Lando keep his mental state kind of locked in and continue to have good day after good day? And if he does that mean he's still contending with his teammate? Next would be just kind of how Mercedes adjusts for next week, how the cars all perform on a very different track, and of course, if there's more space opened up by Oscar and Lando continuing to fight, that allows someone else to slip through in that championship race. Until next week, you can always find me on social media, and that's of course where you would also submit your questions, hot takes, and predictions to include them in next week's podcast episode. You can find me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Marissa Kumari, and you can also join the Grid Chat Discord server. We use that Discord server to watch the races together, which is really fun, especially if you're generally watching them alone, or if you're waking up at odd hours of the day and you're just looking for some emotional support. And it's also a place to ask those questions if you need to, and to find kind of like-minded, not judgmental people who like Formula One. You can join that by clicking the link in the episode description, and on one of those many platforms, whether it's that you're watching the episode on YouTube or you follow me on social media, let me know what you are thinking about for next week. Let me know what you're thinking about when it comes to this race. Do you want to see Monaco stay on the calendar? Do you feel like it doesn't work? Did you see Lando's win coming? And where do you think everything is going to shake out next week? Be sure to find me at Marissa Kumari on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, and let me know. And I'll see you next week for Barcelona.